There's a town in Arizona where the mail still comes in by mule train because there is no road in or out, not a dirt road, not a Jeep trail, nothing a truck has ever driven on. Google Maps can walk you to the trailhead. After that, for 8 miles straight down into a canyon, you're on your own. And that's not even the strangest entry on this list. 9 Arizona towns so remote that Google Maps either can't find them, routes you wrong, or just quietly draws a straight line through terrain no car has ever actually crossed. A ghost town literally named after having nothing in it. A reservation community where the official coordinates still send you to the wrong canyon. A wilderness settlement so far down a washboard road that the county stopped grading it years ago and nobody complained. Because almost nobody's out there to complain. Some of these towns still show up on paper maps from 40 years ago and have simply vanished from the digital ones since, which tells you something about how official these directions really are. This isn't spooky ambiance. This isn't a list of ghost towns for the sake of it. Every single one of these is a real place, with real stakes if you show up unprepared. If you've ever grumbled about a dead zone on a road trip, stick around, because you're about to see what no service actually means. Subscribe before Google fixes the map. Number 9. Number 9 is Portal, Arizona. And here's the thing about remote that most lists get wrong. It's not really about pavement. Portal has a paved road. It's got electricity, a general store, and a handful of full-time residents tucked into Cave Creek Canyon on the Arizona side of the Chiricahua Mountains, right up against the New Mexico line. What Portal doesn't have is anything else. The nearest hospital is over an hour away. The nearest grocery store with real selection is close to that. Cell service comes and goes depending on which canyon wall you're standing next to, and most visitors just accept that texts will send whenever they feel like sending, sometimes 20 minutes after you type them. Even the mail carrier here works a route that would make a city postal worker's head spin. One long loop covering ranches spread out over dozens of square miles for every household it serves. That's the actual definition this whole list runs on. Not how far you are from a highway, but how far you are from help. Portal happens to sit inside one of the best birding corridors in North America. Elegant trogons, hummingbirds nobody else in the country gets to see, hikers who show up specifically to disappear into Cave Creek Canyon for a few days. The canyon looks like something out of a different state entirely. Red rock walls closing in tight enough to block the sky by mid-afternoon. Ground that in an actual number. The nearest full-service town, Douglas, is roughly 65 miles away, and on the New Mexico side, the closest thing resembling a neighbor is a town so small it barely counts as one either. No fire department, no urgent care. Emergency services here run on a volunteer system stretched thin across a huge amount of ground, which is a fact every single resident already knows and every visitor genuinely should. Locals here will tell you, half joking, that the real address system in Portal is landmarks, past the second cattle guard, before the wash. Because street numbers only get you so far when half the roads aren't paved, and none of them have signs worth trusting. There's a general store that doubles as the unofficial town hall, a research station that's quietly hosted decades of ornithology work most of the country has never heard of, and a summer monsoon season that can turn a normally dry wash into a genuine hazard within about 20 minutes. No warning beyond a distant rumble of thunder up canyon. Portal isn't hiding. It's just so far past the last exit that hiding was never necessary. And it's got nothing on what's coming next. Because the next town on this list isn't just far from a hospital, it's sitting right on an international border most GPS apps don't even bother routing traffic toward. Number 8 is Sasabe, Arizona. This is a town so small the entire population could fit in one classroom, sitting right on the U.S. Mexico border at the far southern edge of the state, wedged between the Buenos Aires National Wildlife Refuge and open ranchland that stretches for miles in every direction. There's a border crossing here, a real, functioning port of entry. And somehow that's the most surprising fact about the place, because everything around it looks like it hasn't changed in 80 years. Adobe buildings and a general store that's opened and closed more times than anyone bothers counting anymore. The whole community grew up almost entirely around ranching and the crossing itself, never a mining boom or a railroad stop to fall back on once traffic slowed down, which means there was never really a bigger version of Sasabe to shrink back down from. The drive down from Tucson takes well over an hour, most of it through grassland so open you can watch a storm system build from 30 miles out, no trees or buildings tall enough to block the view in any direction. Ranchers out here have run cattle across this same grassland for generations, long before the border crossing existed in its current form, and the pace of life still moves closer to that ranching rhythm than to anything resembling a border town bustle. There's no gas station reliably open. There's no cell tower doing you any favors either. The historic ranch house that anchors the whole community has been photographed more than the town itself, mostly by people who got lost trying to find it and pulled over to figure out where they'd ended up. The border crossing itself keeps unusual hours and unusual traffic. Mostly ranchers and refuge staff who've made the trip so many times they don't bother checking a map anymore, alongside the occasional lost tourist who assumed a border town would feel bigger than it actually is. Next door, Buenos Aires National Wildlife Refuge protects one of the last wild stretches of grassland like this left in the Southwest. Pronghorn romet, reintroduced after nearly disappearing from the state entirely. Spotting one from the road feels less like luck and more like the landscape doing exactly what it's supposed to. Sasabe isn't remote because nobody built anything here. It's remote because the border crossing that justified the town's existence sees a fraction of the traffic it used to, and the desert simply reclaimed the difference, one closed storefront at a time. If Sasabe feels like the edge of the map, wait until you see the town where the pavement runs out entirely and the elevation climbs 8,000 feet just to get there. Number 7 is Jacob Lake, Arizona. This barely qualifies as a town at all, and that's exactly the point. Jacob Lake is a lodge, a gas station, a campground, and a junction, the last stop before the road to the Grand Canyon's north rim, sitting up on the Kaibab Plateau at nearly 8,000 feet, surrounded by ponderosa pine forest that looks more like Colorado than anything most people picture when they hear Arizona. The name itself comes from Mormon pioneer Jacob Hamblin, who used the small lake here as a stopping point on trips across the plateau in the 1800s, back when this entire stretch of forest was crossed by wagon instead of highway. The permanent population is small enough to count on your fingers. Everyone else working up there is seasonal, and every single one of them leaves when the snow closes the road for the winter, because Jacob Lake genuinely cannot be reached once that happens. Not by plow, not by chains, not by anything short of waiting for spring. One fact grounds just how isolated this actually is. The North Rim itself, less than an hour further down the highway, is open roughly 6 months a year, and Jacob Lake exists almost entirely to serve the trickle of traffic headed there before shutting its own doors right along with it. The nearest hospital is a genuine emergency flight situation, not a drive. The terrain and the distance both work against ground transport once winter sets in. In the warmer months, the pine forest up there smells like vanilla in the afternoon heat, cool enough at that elevation that visitors regularly show up in July wearing shorts and regret it by sundown. Cookies the size of a dinner plate. The lodge's small bakery has become something of a legend among Grand Canyon regulars, a strange little reward for travelers who've usually just driven hours through open range to get there. None of that changes the math once the first real snowstorm rolls through, typically sometime in late fall, and the plows simply stop coming because there's no longer anyone up there left to plow for. If you've made it this far into the video and you're already picturing yourself at 8,000 feet with pine trees instead of neighbors, that's the algorithm doing its job. Go ahead and hit that like button now, because the next 3 towns on this list stop being quaint and start being genuinely hard to find. Jacob Lake disappears every winter on a schedule. The next town disappears anytime a tourist takes a wrong turn on a mountain pass with no guardrail. Number 6 is Oatman, Arizona. This old Route 66 mining town sits in the Black Mountains, and the only way in by car is Sitgreaves Pass, a narrow, switchbacking stretch of 2-lane road with hairpin turns tight enough that RVs and trailers are flatly advised against attempting it. No guardrails on most of the drop-offs, and barely enough shoulder to pull over if something goes wrong. The town boomed in the early 1900s when a nearby gold strike briefly made it one of the largest settlements in the territory, a population that collapsed almost as fast as it rose once the richest veins ran dry. Wild burros, descendants of pack animals turned loose when the mines shut down decades ago, wander straight down the middle of Oatman's main street and stick their heads into car windows for carrots, completely unbothered by the tourists. Here's the less charming version. If your car breaks down on that pass, you are, quite literally, on your own for a meaningful stretch of time, because tow trucks treat Sitgreaves Pass the way most people treat a personal favor, reluctantly and only in daylight. Older maps used to route Route 66 travelers straight over this pass as the only option between Kingman and California, and plenty of longtime residents still swap stories about drivers who never quite got comfortable with the drop-offs. Radiators boiling over on the steepest grades back before modern cooling systems made the climb less of a gamble. The gunfight reenactments and Old West storefronts keep tourists entertained during the day, staged shootouts timed for the tour buses that make the climb up from Kingman. Then, the last shop closes. The day trippers head back down the pass, and Oatman goes quiet fast, streetlights sparse and the mountain silence settling back in almost immediately, the burros themselves wandering off toward the hills like they know the show's over for the day. Oatman survives almost entirely on tourism now, a town of a few hundred people propped up by day trippers willing to take the pass, which means the road that makes it so hard to reach is also the only thing keeping it alive. That's a strange kind of remote, isolated enough to feel dangerous, popular enough to have a gift shop. The next town on this list doesn't have a gift shop. It doesn't have anything, and that's the entire premise of its name. Number 5 is Nothing, Arizona. This is, without exaggeration, a ghost town literally named Nothing, a rest stop on Highway 93 between Wickenburg and Kingman that, at its absolute peak, had a gas station, a store, and a population that topped out somewhere around 4 people. The name wasn't a joke played on the town by outsiders. The founders picked it themselves back in the 1970s, apparently deciding that honesty was funnier than trying to sell the place as something it wasn't. Today, even that founding population is gone. What's left is a fading sign, some crumbling foundations, and a stretch of highway with no cell service for miles in either direction, the kind of empty that makes you check your gas gauge twice even when you know it's fine. We're now solidly past the halfway point of this list, and it's worth being straight with you. Everything from here forward isn't just remote in the long drive sense. These are the towns where the roads themselves start working against you. Washboard gravel, reservation routes that don't match commercial GPS data, private land with no posted address at all. Nothing earns its spot at number 5 because it's the cleanest proof of concept for the entire list. A place doesn't need people, buildings, or services to exist on a map. It just needs a name and a sign, that's it. State highway crews have talked about removing the old sign more than once over the years, and every time, something closer to local tradition than official policy has kept it standing. Truckers who drive this stretch regularly still use it as a mile marker of sorts. A handful of travelers pull over every week just to take a photo next to it, the joke writing itself every single time, arriving somewhere specifically to prove they went nowhere. Nobody's fixed the road. Nobody's rebuilt the gas station. Nobody seems especially inclined to try, which is either the most honest thing about this entire list or the funniest, depending on your mood driving through it. The next 4 towns take that idea and go somewhere far stranger. Number 4 is Cibecue, Arizona. Tucked into a canyon on the Fort Apache Indian Reservation in the White Mountains, Cibecue is a genuine community. Homes, a school, a store. But getting there reliably is its own small ordeal. The community sits along Cibecue Creek, one of the few reliable year-round waterways in this part of the state, and the surrounding canyon walls are steep enough that cell towers built for the flatter parts of the reservation simply don't reach in here at all. Reservation roads here don't always match what a commercial GPS app thinks they should look like. Turn-by-turn directions have been known to route visitors toward washes instead of the actual road, and a tribal permit is required to visit large parts of the surrounding land, which most out-of-state map apps have absolutely no idea about. The canyon itself carries a piece of real history too, the site of a well-documented 1881 conflict between the U.S. Army and Apache Scouts that still gets studied in military history courses today, a heavier legacy than most tiny mapping error footnotes usually carry. One honest note here, because this channel doesn't want to overstate it. Cibecue isn't cut off the way some of the other towns on this list are. It has real infrastructure and a real, living community that's been there for generations. Treating it like an abandoned curiosity would be both wrong and disrespectful to the people who call it home. What earns it a spot on this list is purely a mapping problem, the disconnect between what a phone tells you and what the actual roads on the ground require, in a landscape where getting that wrong can mean hours added to a trip that should have taken 20 minutes. Visitors who've made the drive describe the same experience almost every time. Full GPS confidence right up until the app suggests a turn that doesn't exist, followed by an hour of educated guessing along roads with no signage at all. Locals have gotten used to it. Fielding a confused out-of-towner at the trading post is practically routine, usually met with a patient explanation that the app is wrong, not the road. The next town on this list doesn't have that problem, mostly because there's almost nothing left there to navigate to. Number 3 is Christmas, Arizona, a former copper mining camp named, appropriately, because the original claim was filed on December 25th back in 1902. Christmas has been fading off the map for the better part of a century. What's left now sits on private land near the Gila River, close enough to San Carlos Apache Reservation land that the boundary lines alone are confusing, reachable only by unmaintained roads that most rental car companies would flatly refuse to let you drive on. The surrounding hills are dry and scrubby, cut through with old mining scars that are still visible from the air decades after the last serious digging stopped. A landscape that looks abandoned even in the sections that technically aren't. No town center. Just scattered mining debris, a handful of ruins, and a name that shows up more often in ghost town enthusiast forums than it does in any official state directory. Ground that history in the practical reality. Christmas doesn't appear with reliable directions on most map services, because there's genuinely nothing left to direct you to. It's a place people find by already knowing exactly where to look, not a place people stumble into. The mine here ran on and off for decades under several different owners, and every time it closed, a few more roofs came down and a few more roads went unmaintained, until the town simply stopped being a place you could arrive at and became a place you could only research. Old company records suggest a population in the low hundreds during the busiest stretches, workers and their families packed into housing that's long since collapsed or been hauled away, leaving almost nothing standing to mark where any of it used to be. Every December, a small handful of ghost town enthusiasts and history buffs make the trek out specifically because of the name, posting photos with captions that write themselves. Though the actual mining history here, copper prices rising and falling, the camp swelling and emptying along with them, is a far more interesting story than the holiday pun most visitors come for. That's a very different kind of remote than a bad road or a long drive. It's a town that slipped almost entirely out of the modern navigation system, one wrong turn away from being erased from casual memory the way it's already been erased from most maps. The next town on this list hasn't disappeared yet, but the road getting there has done its absolute best to make you think it might. Number 2 is Klondike, Arizona. Sitting at the edge of the Aravaipa Canyon Wilderness in Graham County, Klondike is reached by a long stretch of dirt and gravel road so notoriously rough that locals talk about it the way other people talk about airport security, an unavoidable hassle you plan your entire trip around. The name itself is a leftover from the Gold Rush era, borrowed optimistically from the far more famous Klondike in Canada by prospectors who never quite struck it as rich as the name promised. Washouts after summer monsoons can close sections of it entirely, sometimes for days, with no detour and no warning beyond word of mouth from whoever drove it last. And the county's grading schedule out here runs on a timeline best described as eventually. Ranchers who've worked this valley their whole lives still time errands around the weather forecast, the way city drivers time them around rush hour, because out here, the road itself is the traffic. A small handful of residents still call Klondike home, along with the old post office building that once served a much bigger mining-era population than exists there now, back when the surrounding hills briefly promised more gold and silver than they ever actually delivered. The general store that once anchored the community closed decades ago, and what passes for local news out here now travels mostly by word of mouth between the ranches, since the nearest reliable internet connection is a genuine drive rather than a hotspot. What makes it worth the drive, for the people who make it, is Aravaipa Canyon itself, a permit-only wilderness area home to desert bighorn sheep and a year-round stream that's rare enough in this state to draw hikers from across the country. Ground that beauty in the number that actually matters here. Getting a permit takes planning, and getting to the trailhead takes a vehicle with real clearance. Getting help if something goes wrong takes considerably longer than anyone would like to think about out loud, since the nearest paved road and reliable cell signal are both a genuine haul from the canyon floor. Klondike is about as close as an inhabited Arizona town gets to true wilderness. There's exactly one place left on this list that goes further, and it doesn't have a road at all. Number 1 is Supai, Arizona, home of the Supai tribe, and this is the twist this entire list has been building toward. No road, no highway, not even a dirt track wide enough for a vehicle of any kind leads into the village, and Supai is the only place in the continental United States that still receives its mail by mule train, 3 days a week, the same way it has for roughly a century. The Havasupai have lived in this canyon for centuries, long before it had a mail route or a permit system, and the tribe's name itself translates roughly to people of the blue-green waters, a description that turns out to be remarkably literal once you see the creek for yourself. The only way in is an 8-mile hike or mule ride down from Hualapai Hilltop, or a helicopter flight on the days one happens to be running, weather and demand permitting. 8 miles closes the loop, the same number this list opened on, 8 miles down, on foot, into a canyon, past waterfalls that draw hikers from around the entire world once they arrive. Havasu Falls, turquoise water against red rock, a color combination that looks fake in photos and somehow looks even less real in person. The color comes from dissolved travertine minerals in the creek, the same natural process that built the pools and terraces the falls are famous for. Ground even that in the practical reality. Every grocery item, every package, every piece of mail for the roughly 600 people who live in Supai comes down that same 8 miles, on the back of a mule. That's still the only way. The village runs its own tourism permit system for exactly this reason, since an unmanaged flood of hikers on a trail with no road backup would strand the whole community's supply chain overnight. Google Maps can get you to the parking lot at the top. Everything after that belongs to the mules. So, there you have it, 9 Arizona towns that range from long drive with bad cell service, all the way to no road has ever existed here at all. Before you plan a trip based on this list, a quick reality check. Several of these towns, especially Christmas and parts of Cibecue's surrounding land, sit on private or tribal property where uninvited visitors aren't just unwelcome, they may be trespassing. Supai requires a permit system that fills up fast and should be booked well in advance, not decided on a whim the week of a trip, and several other entries on this list, Klondike and Sasabe especially, involve roads that a standard sedan simply should not attempt, no matter how confident the GPS sounds. None of this is meant to scare you off. Arizona has more genuinely wild, disconnected corners than almost any state outside Alaska, and every single one of the 9 places on this list is a real, visitable location for someone who plans ahead and respects the land and the people already living there. Preparation beats improvisation out here, every time. What separates a good trip to one of these towns from a bad one usually comes down to a full tank of gas before you leave pavement, a downloaded offline map instead of relying on live signal, and someone back home who actually knows your route. The one real takeaway is this: remoteness in Arizona isn't measured in miles from a highway. It's measured in how far you are from help if something goes wrong. Half the places on this list are farther from civilization while sitting closer to a paved road than you'd ever guess, and the other half don't even offer a road to measure the distance from in the first place. So before you head out to chase one of these towns for yourself, ask a few practical questions first. Ask what the cell coverage actually looks like along the specific route, not just at the destination, since coverage maps published by carriers are notoriously optimistic compared to what you'll actually get in a canyon. Ask whether the road requires real clearance or a permit you haven't applied for yet, and check that against the vehicle you're actually planning to drive, not the one you wish you'd rented. And ask yourself, honestly, what the plan is if something goes wrong 40 miles from the nearest tow truck, because I'll just call someone. Stops being a plan the moment the bars on your phone disappear. If this video talked you out of trusting your GPS quite so blindly, do the 2 things that keep this channel going. Hit like and subscribe, because I go find the corners of the map other channels don't bother reaching, every single week. Drop a comment and tell me which of these 9 towns you'd actually attempt, and which one you'd only ever watch from right here. And if you've actually been to one of these, Supai especially, since I know some of you have made that hike, tell me what the video got right and what it missed, because a mule train doesn't exactly show up in satellite footage. I'll see you in the next one, and if you can't find this channel next week, check your signal before you check the search bar. Some habits are hard to break out here.